Chapter 27, Santa Claus. "Don't do this, Renyer," Chris begged the beast. "You're her brother." Krampus growled as he stood over Ava, ready to kill.
"I killed my father," the beast reminded him. "What makes you think I'd go soft now?"
Chris looked on in horror as the love of his life was about to be killed. There was nothing he could do fast enough to stop it. And then, all of a sudden, a giant gust of winter wind blew over them. The sleigh turned over as the reindeer struggled to keep their footing in the deep snow. A special item that had been sitting on the seat of the sleigh rolled out onto the snow before Krampus's feet. It was Jack's top hat. Krampus brushed off the snow that had temporarily covered his face and lifted his front claws to sink them into Ava. Chris cried out desperately as he ran toward her, but even as he did so, he knew he would be too late. In that very moment, something very unexpected happened. The hat on the ground before Krampus began to swirl upward as if carried toward the sky in a snowy tornado. Krampus fell back as the magical scene began to unfold. The swirling snow dissipated, revealing a human-like figure completely made of ice and snow, the top hat resting upon its head. Chris looked at the snowman with amazement. His appearance was simple and not fully formed, but as Chris saw the face of the personage, he knew this was his friend. "Jack!" Chris cried out in surprised delight. Krampus's red eyes widened with fear, completely taken aback by the sudden appearance of Jack's likeness. "Not Jack," the snowman said, looking at Krampus instead of his friend. "What was it you called me before you killed me? Frosty?" Krampus let out a hideous roar as he tried striking his talons against the snowman, but found the effort useless as the snowman's icy exterior was like stone to his claws. Chris did not hesitate. He charged at the beast with all his might and knocked him to the ground. Chris, after all, now had nothing to fear. "The war is over, Renyer," Chris declared, pinning the beast's arms into the snow. "You cannot kill me. You cannot win." Krampus knew his defeat. He was still wounded from Grinker's arrow to his neck, and Chris now had a sword above his head.
"Spare me," the beast pleaded. "Let me go, and I promise never to return."
Chris glared at his enemy. "Your promises mean nothing to me," he shot back. But even as he said it, he dropped his sword in the snow. "But I'm not a killer. I'm not like you. The shepherds have a motto," Chris explained. "Goodwill to all. Maybe that even includes you. I will let you go, but I will never allow you to overpower my people again. You stay away from Silverbell. Go live in the dreary wilderness as the beast you are." Krampus stood up and let out a snarl of protest, but realized his defeat.
"You will not always be able to protect your people," the beast taunted Chris. "You cannot always be with them."
Chris pointed off to the distance. "Leave," he commanded. Krampus flapped his wings and flew off as ordered. Chris immediately ran to the side of Ava. She was breathing with great difficulty, her wounds in the cold of the snow sending her closer to death. "Grinkers, let's rush Ava back to Silverbell before it's too late," Chris said with great urgency. Ava reached out her hand to grab Chris's arm. "I told you," she reminded him. "Wherever you are is where I will be." Chris held her head in his hands. "You can still survive," he told her. "You do not want to spend an eternity here with me." He looked away for a moment as the thought pained him. "Besides," he continued, "do you know what one of the first questions I asked Percy's parchment was? I asked if Kris Kringle would marry Princess Ava, and it told me no." Ava looked up at him with a sad face. "And I won't. I can't," she admitted. Chris nodded his head, pained by what he heard, but trying to act as though he was not. "I fell in love with Kris Kringle," she continued, "but that is no longer the man who stands before me now. You are a new person. You are the most kind and loyal man I know. And if you will have me, nothing in this world would please me more than to be called Mrs. Claus." Chris smiled as he wiped away the tears that had begun to fall down her cheeks. "I love you, Santa Claus," she said aloud with a smile. As she said the name, the North Pole again ignited its magic and cast its light upon her. Her wounds healed and her energy returned. The two embraced each other and might have continued to do so for the rest of their eternity together if someone did not interrupt them. I'd like to point out that I kind of saved the princess's life and made this whole loving reunion possible, Jack's snowman persona interjected. I mean, I know I'm just a snowman now, but... Chris ran up to his friend, laughing. Oh, Jack, how in the world are you here? He asked with a mixture of delight and confusion. Well, first of all, you're welcome, he replied. But to answer your question, I don't know. And yet, I always knew I would be back. I know that sounds crazy, but I suppose there are things that even I cannot understand. He looked up at the top hat on his head. I hid Percy's parchment in my hat since the moment you gave it to me. It must have absorbed some of the magic somehow. Grinkers, who was watching the interaction with a smile, chimed in. You need not think of magic as an unexplainable and unknowable force, the wise elf counseled. In fact, I have found that certain humans possess more magic than we elves do. When you act in pure love for another, there is no limit to what can happen and what can be overcome. Even death bows to the magic that is love. And Jack, from what I hear, you died because of your loyalty to Chris. There is no greater love than a man giving his life for a friend. Speaking of love, Jack said, looking at Chris and Ava holding hands, I think a marriage is in order. Chris turned to Ava, who looked at him with a wide smile. We can fly back to Silverbell and have St. Martin marry us today, he suggested. He then paused as a sad thought occurred to him. Assuming there still is a Silverbell. In their jubilation of casting out Krampus, they had temporarily forgotten that the war could still be raging in the village. We must go there immediately, Ava pleaded. They may still need our help. The two quickly overturned the sleigh and mounted it. Are you coming, Grinkers? Chris asked the elf. Grinkers shook his head. Remember the spell that we have all invited upon ourselves, he reminded them. If you leave now, you cannot be gone for longer than a day, and then you cannot leave this place again for another year. Chris and Ava looked at each other. We have to ensure our friends are safe, she told him. We will go, he agreed. And I'll keep the snowman company, Grinkers replied playfully. When the sleigh touched down in Silverbell, Chris and Ava were devastated by the destruction they saw. The village was mostly destroyed. Roofs and fences broken down, houses left in ash, and debris littered across the once beautiful fields. As they exited the sleigh, the surviving villagers began gathering to greet them. To the encouragement of Chris and Ava, it seemed to them that most of the villagers appeared to have survived the war. We won, Rudy stated simply, when Chris asked him for a report. How many lost? Chris asked with concern. Miraculously, none have fallen, though many are badly wounded, Rudy replied. Those of Renier's army who did not fall by the sword retreated in defeat when they saw their leader fly away. But it seems all the elves are missing. As if by cue, Felix's voice was heard in the distance. Not missing, he said as the whole army of elves approached them from the road that led to the castle. Just on a special assignment from Kris Kringle. Did you find it? Chris asked Felix with anticipation in his voice. Of course, Felix replied, holding up Percy's parchment. Located right where you thought it would be. We also set free all the animals that Renier had imprisoned, and ensured none of Renier's men had remained in the castle. He handed the parchment to Chris. Thank you, Felix, Chris said sincerely, and then turned to the crowd that was continuing to gather around them. And thank you to all. Your loyalty has inspired and strengthened me. You have proved what King Wenceslas believed. Power is found in goodness, not in armies and thrones. You have won the war, and now Renier will never return. You are free. The crowd cheered wildly in celebration, but as the cheering died out, Chris again addressed them, this time in a somber tone. But I'm afraid I can no longer be your king in Silverbell, he confessed, and many in the crowd looked at him with concern and confusion. Destiny, it seems, has bestowed upon me a different and everlasting burden and privilege. There were many whisperings among the crowd, and one voice called out above the rest. Who will be our leader, then? Chris removed the king's silver medallion that had been given him by Wenceslas. There is in my mind only one choice, Chris answered. Your king should be a man who has proved his devotion to the kingdom and who desires the well-being of its people above all else. Someone who can light the way to a better day for Silverbell. I name Rudy Chesterton as king. There were gasps and applause from the crowd, but Rudy shook his head in protest.
No, no, Your Highness. I couldn't possibly, he protested. I'm just a rancher. I was not born to be a king.
Chris handed him the star-engraved medallion. You have no idea what you were born to be, Chris said with a smile. There is a king inside you yet. Rudy refused to accept the medallion. Rudy, Chris pleaded, but he again argued against the decision. Rudolph, Chris now addressed him with firmness. I need you to lead the way for me, for this people. The leader of the shepherds looked at the medallion and then at his friend. He nodded slowly and accepted the medallion. And this, Chris added as he began to remove Wenceslas's robe. No, Rudy stopped him. I will accept this position you so graciously bestow, but that robe belongs to you. Chris turned to again survey the destruction of the village. Where will they live? Ava asked him quietly. They will rebuild. But what about tonight, and tomorrow, and the coming days? Chris turned to her and smiled. Is your room available? Ava smiled back and turned to the crowd. I too have been called another way, she told her people. But in my last action as princess, let me offer up the castle as your temporary shelter. Gather whatever belongings you have left, and stay wherever you can find room. Paul smiled. There is plenty of food in the kitchen, he added. We will survive the winter and rebuild in time. Rudy called out upon the people he had now been given authority to lead. To the castle! The villagers cheered as they began to slowly make their way toward the royal grounds. Chris watched as the people of Silverbell walked away. His heart suddenly sunk as he noticed the small children in the throng who shuffled along with their heads hung low. Whenever there is war, whenever there is evil, it is the children that suffer the most, Chris observed softly as Ava nodded her agreement. They have lost more than anyone today, she added. Chris looked down at the elves that had stayed behind. I know I have asked so much of you already, Chris admitted, but I wonder if I could enlist your help again. Felix looked up at him with his usual smile. What do you have in mind, boss? The castle was a hub of activity and celebration as Chris and Ava entered it later that night. It seemed as though every section of the castle was being used up by the many villagers that now temporarily called it home. Still wearing his red and white garb and hat, Chris greeted once more the citizens he would soon be leaving. Over his shoulder, he carried a large red sack. What's in that bag? A little girl asked him as he walked through the main hall. I'm glad you asked, Chris said with a big grin, and reached into the bag to pull out one of the many toys Felix and the elves had just made. She danced in delight as Chris handed her this unexpected present. It was not long before all the children of Silverbell surrounded Chris, each waiting in eager anticipation for him to offer them a gift. And if you all behave, Chris told them after he handed out the final toy, I will be back again next year to give you even more gifts. But you must be good. A little boy chuckled as he stared lovingly at his toy. But how will you know if we are good or not? He asked. Chris smiled at the question and thought for a moment. He reached into his pocket and pulled out Percy's parchment. After Ava handed him a pen, he wrote on the parchment, Who is naughty? Who is nice? Immediately, a long list of different names appeared under both questions. The children looked at the magical parchment in amazement, letting out gasps and squeals that showed their excitement. But that's a lot of names, another child said. What if you can't find mine? Chris laughed and rubbed the child's head. I'll check it twice, he promised. After enjoying an evening of music, socializing, and a great deal of milk and cookies for Chris, he and Ava said their final goodbyes to the people after ensuring that everything was in order for them. The night was getting very late, and they knew they must return to the land of the North Pole before their one-day leave expired. They entered the sleigh and began to fly away from the castle. As they passed over the kingdom, they could not help but look down and admire the beloved home they would surely miss. But as Chris looked down, he noticed a small fire glowing in the green pasture. It appeared to be burning within the stable, where the shepherds had held all their meetings. I have to check something, Chris told Ava, and flew the sleigh down into the green pasture, landing upon the grass. You must hurry, she pleaded. Our time is almost up, and the spell says our youth fades away with every moment we're away. Chris nodded his agreement and jumped out of the sleigh. He made his way through the grassy field until he reached the stable. There was indeed a small fire burning, and Chris could now see that it was built to warm a small family gathered in the stable. A man and woman were huddled together, looking over a manger with great love and concern. Chris furrowed his brow as he approached. Why did they have such interest in this simple box of straw? But as he approached, he saw why. Inside the manger was much more than just straw. A newborn baby lay sleeping, wrapped in meager clothing. "What are you doing here?" he asked the new parents with great concern in his voice. "This is no place for an infant to be welcomed into the world." The father nodded his head, almost shamefully. "We knew everyone was headed for the castle, and we heard there was no room left. At least, not enough to ensure the privacy we sought for his delivery." Chris looked down at the baby boy. Despite the circumstances, he was sleeping peacefully. Indeed, Chris felt as though a piece of heaven lay before him now. "It is a cold night," Chris observed as tears began to fill his eyes. The child's mother nodded. Chris looked back at Ava in the sleigh. She looked back at him with sadness on her face. She held up his bag, which was now empty. They had no more gifts to give. Chris again gazed down at the baby, and as he did so, he thought of one last thing he could offer. He removed his robe and rested it gently upon the babe in the manger. "Your Highness, we are not worthy of this," the father protested humbly. Chris looked at him, his lips quivering with emotion. "You are worthy of my love," he replied. Chris knelt down and kissed the baby's forehead, the child stirring only slightly as the rough whiskers of Chris's beard scratched his skin. He embraced the mother and father and promised them that all would be well. Chris made his way back to the sleigh, and as he did so, he began to notice a change within himself. His beard and hair were starting to turn white. Ava's blonde hair was too turning gray, and her face began to form wrinkles. Chris looked out and saw that the sun was beginning to peek over the horizon. Their day had ended. "I'm sorry," he said, entering the sleigh very quickly now. But Ava placed her hand patiently on his. "Do not apologize," she said. "When I look at your face forevermore and see your white beard, I will be reminded that the reason you look the way you do is because you once took the time to help a child born in a stable." She kissed him with now aging lips. Chris smiled. "It's time to go," he said, and turning to the reindeer, he called them by name. "On Dasher, on Dancer, on Prancer, on Vixen, on Comet, on Cupid, on Donner, on Blitzen!" The sleigh lifted up and they soared through the winter air. After passing over the mountains, they soon arrived at the snowy terrain of the North Pole. Grinkers had already built a small home for himself and was starting to create a bigger one for Chris and Ava. "You're late," he scolded them as they exited the sleigh. But then he smiled. "I see you brought my friends with you." Chris and Ava looked back at the sleigh with puzzlement and suddenly saw Felix and the elves appear from the back of the sleigh. "We gotta set some ground rules about when and where you can turn invisible," Chris chuckled. "You sure this is where you all want to be?" "We are without a home," Felix reminded him. "We wish to create one with you here." The elves ran over to Grinkers, who immediately began directing them in creating a new village. Chris and Ava looked out at the tireless elves and smiled. Chris's smile disappeared as a thought returned to him. "Oh no," he said aloud. "What?" Ava asked with concern. "We only had one day to spend in Silverbell, and we didn't ask St. Martin to marry us." Ava too was saddened by the thought. "Perhaps next year." "Don't be ridiculous," a familiar voice called out. The couple turned to see Jack's snowy form standing there. "Chris, you're the king of the land of the North Pole now. What you say goes. Anyone can perform a marriage here." Chris smiled as he considered the proposal. "I guess that's true," Chris remarked. "But who could I have marry us?" Jack straightened his top hat upon his head. "Well, I know I'm no parson, but I would be happy to get the job done. I mean, if you can be St. Nicholas." "Ho, ho, ho, very funny," Chris replied, as Ava laughed more sincerely. "All right, Frosty," Chris added playfully. "Why don't you marry us?" "It would be my pleasure, Mr. and Mrs. Claus," Jack said with a wide smile. There was so much ahead of them, an eternity in fact. But to Chris and Ava, the most memorable and important day of any year would always be that one. It was the day the war against evil was won. It was the day Silverbell was given renewed hope. It was the day that an everlasting home in the North was established, and a new union between a man and woman pronounced. The elves would continue to make gifts, and Chris would deliver them during the one day a year he was granted. Each time it would be special, magical, even perfect. But none would be more special, more perfect, than that first night. The night Chris visited a small family in a humble stable. The night that a baby boy was laid in a manger, clothed in the robes of a king.